Hi, Misha here, and started off looking at Japanese cruisers with the A-Class or heavy cruisers, the Furitaka and the Aoba. And now we're going to move on to the next class, the Myoko or Myoko. And I have three examples here. They had four in the class. I have Myoko herself, I have Nachi, and I have Haruna, and the one I'm missing is Ashigara, but they don't make Ashigara in the EAglemoss line. So this is what we have, and these are all pretty similar because they're World War II configuration. The Nachi up here is 1941, but Myoko and Haruna are both 1944. And these are the first heavy cruisers designed in Japan after they signed the Washington Naval Treaty. So their design began in 1922, although they would not join the fleet until 1929. And they were built based on the Furitaka, the Aoba hull, but larger. And they really did try to keep them under 10,000 tons, which was the limit set by the Naval Treaty. But in reality, because Japan wanted to have as heavily armed of a cruiser as possible, they ended up being 11,000 and then 11,500 tons, and then they could even jump up to 13 and 14,000 when fully laden. Of course, by World War II, this really didn't matter. In their day, in their time, they were the most heavily armed cruisers in the world. They were also quite fast, and they really were the first 10-ton cruisers built post-World War I, so post-Naval Treaty, in the world. They're quite a bit bigger than the Furitakas. They are just a hair under 670 feet long. They have a crew between 770 and 780 standard. They were built with a catapult and originally to carry two seaplanes, two float planes. Originally they had a top speed of between 35.5 and 36 knots, so that's basically 50 miles per hour. It's pretty good. And they had a total of 10 of the 7.9-inch guns and 5 dual turrets. Plus they had 12 torpedo single-shot launchers initially. And the turrets are quite interesting how they're set up on these. The front especially, they're kind of this pyramid scheme, which will become pretty standard with a lot of Japanese cruisers. There's just two in the back. But they were pretty interesting and impressive machines. And they all pretty well went into service around the same time. They would have their first major refit between 1934 and 1936. This is when they would get the updated 8-inch guns, still keeping a total of 10 of them. They would also get newer flight decks, capable of carrying up to 3 float planes. They're admittedly pretty weak in the beginning. Anti-aircraft armament would be improved. And they would go away from the single-serve torpedo launchers to the new kind of turreted quad style. And then there'd be another kind of upgrade in 1939 where they would again up the anti-aircraft, and they would again add a couple more torpedo launchers, really bolstering all of that. They would also expand the bulges on the side, often called torpedo bulges. That was more for stability because they were trying to make these to a weight restriction, but they also wanted such heavy armaments and modern bridge and aircraft. They ended up being quite top heavy. That gets into the 4th Fleet incident. But they added the bulges to try to correct this and really modernize the cruisers before war. The only real downside was the top speed dropped to about 34 knots, so they lost between 1.5 and 2 knots in speed. But they would gain quite a bit extra. And yeah, there were 4 in the class, and they would all be used often together, or at least closely in pairs, alongside some of the older cruisers and some of the newer cruisers. So let's talk a bit about their service histories. Let's start with Nachi. Even though Myoko was laid down first, it was actually the third one to launch. But these were all coming into service in the late 1920s, and they all originally kind of operated together, patrolling off the Chinese coast, and they were all used to escort troop ships in February of 1932 during the so-called Shanghai incident. After that, a couple of years later, they were put into reserve as newer classes of cruiser were coming online, and the idea was to do the update, the reconstruction, the refit, like I talked about. They would get out of that in 1936, 1937, and then they would be used in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1938 and into 1939. So they did have some combat. Then they would go in for their second minor reconstruction. And as far as I know, all of the Myoko-Class would be available around April of 1941. Now, during the Pearl Harbor attack, December 1941, of course, it was Myoko and Nachi operating together, and they were actually used to help cover the invasion of the Philippine Islands. After that, in January and February, they would conduct routine patrols, and most of the class would be used during the Battle of the Java Sea in March, where they pretty much helped mop up most of the Dutch Far East Netherlands fleet. And after that, Nachi would kind of get detached from her sisters. Later that month, she would go back into port to be refit for operations in northern waters, mostly to deal with the seas up there and also the cooler climate. And then she was out by May and starting to do patrols up north. And during the Battle of Midway, she would actually be part of the task force that would head north towards the Aleutian Islands to do that invasion up by Alaska. I've talked about that in my video with the carriers. And she basically kind of make several trips back and forth, plus doing patrols and providing support through July of 1942 up there. And there wouldn't really be a lot for her. She would kind of just move around patrolling the northern seas and whatnot until March of 1943, when she would get in a gun battle with some Allied shipping and have a minor amount of damage. She would go into port, and while they were fixing her damage there, she would get some more anti-aircraft guns, and then she would be back in service in time to support the withdrawal from Kiska in June and July of 1943. In the latter half of 1943, Nachi was used for more patrols, more escorts, and occasionally as a transport for cargo, what have you. However, her career nearly ended on October 6th when a U.S. submarine tracked her, fired a torpedo spread at her, hit her with a torpedo, and it was a dud. You gotta love early war American torpedoes. So the only real damage was just from the impact of the physical torpedo itself, really. not a whole lot there. So she really got lucky. And this is honestly, when it comes to submarines, something you're gonna see with the Myoko-Class is they had good luck with subs. So continuing on, not much happening for her. In 1944, she's reassigned to the Japanese Kure Naval District that summer. She goes in for some training and whatnot. Has more anti-aircraft guns installed because this is 1944 and they're not stupid. Even if they are using the 25mm gun, because a small magazine-loaded gun that would nearly be legal in California is a great idea to shoot down planes. Anyway, so she patrols up there near the Japanese Naval District until October, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. She actually joins her sister, Ashigara, and they bombard some targets and do some fighting on the 24th and 25th. But on the 25th, Nachi and Magami, another cruiser, which we will get to, actually collide and do pretty significant damage to each other. So Nachi has to go into the docks at Manila for emergency repairs, and she's there on the 29th when the Allied bombing raid comes in. She gets hit with one 500-pound bomb and strafed by some machine gun. So an already damaged ship is damaged further, but she's still not critical. But, you know, Americans don't want to leave a job undone. So a week later, on November 5th, when the next major bombing raid happened, she was still there being repaired. Now, she got lucky early on. The first wave of torpedo and dive bombers didn't target her, she didn't get hit. Well, not wanting her to feel left out, the second and third waves did target her. And when I say target her, they hit her with over 24 bombs and nearly a dozen torpedoes. So to say that was the end of Nachi's career in November of 1944 is a pretty firm statement. So yeah, she started off her career operating with her sisters. She was detached up north, and she more or less ended her career operating with her sisters and sinking with several other Japanese ships in Manila Bay. Not a lot to say about the model. Again, this is 1941, so this would have been before Pearl Harbor, after the second reconstruction. So that's the only difference. It wouldn't have any radar sets. It wouldn't have any as many anti-aircraft guns, but it still has the enlarged hull bulges and the multiple quad torpedo launchers. So what about her sisters? So what about Myoko and Haguro? Well, again, they operated together in the beginning of 1942. Now, Myoko was mildly damaged in January and had to put to port for short repair. But Haguro, I can't talk today, I apologize. Haguro would continue on and be in the Indian Sea. And actually they would torpedo a few ships in February. Then Myoko would join them again for the Battle of the Java Sea in March, and continue on from there. They would be deployed for the Battle of the Coral Sea, and again for the Battle of Midway for the main force, but not really seeing much in the way of combat. They would keeping on into the usual, the Guadalcanal campaign in October of 1942. They would help shell Henderson Field, and afterwards, at the beginning of 43, they would both be used to help support the withdrawal from Guadalcanal. After that, they would be used for patrol and escort quite a bit, and February, Myoko would continue the trend with submarines. She was targeted, but the torpedoes missed. And then again in April, she survived a couple of near misses with submarine torpedoes. In June, they would go in for more AA guns and a radar set. And for the rest of the year, they would pretty much be used for escort patrol. And then into 1944, as the Navy was running lower and lower on ships and needing more and more resources, they would be put into service as transport cargo freighters. And they would kind of keep this up until the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June. They were there. That's about all you can say. They really didn't see any action because at this point, it's becoming more and more of a carrier war. And they were there as part of the center force during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Wow, Haguro was pretty lucky at Leyte Gulf. Mikumo was not. Myoko, sorry. She was hit by a torpedo. Okay, not huge damage. She would split off and head to Singapore, Manila, for emergency repairs. And while there, she was kind of in the way during the attacks, and they decided to go ahead and send her on to Japan where they could repair her in safety. But right after she left, I think I said Singapore. I think I said Manila. I apologize if I did Singapore. Anyway, after she left Singapore, heading towards Japan, on the way she would get hit by another torpedo. And by all rights, she should have sunk. It blew off her stern, knocked out 3 or 4 screws, and just did some pretty amazing damage. But, even more amazingly, she still had 1 screw working and was able to make about 6 knots. So, that plus being towed by a destroyer, she was dragged back into Singapore and plopped down there in the harbor. And then in February of 1945, the harbor master took a look. They didn't have the resources to repair her, and they didn't have a way to get her back to Japan because of all the submarines. It would just been there's no way to do it. So he proposed that they just turn her into a floating anti-aircraft battery. This was granted, and that's it. Since being in Singapore, she was kind of out of the way of some of the heavy fighting, unlike up at Japan. She just kind of sat there and weathered the storm for the rest of the year, and then was officially surrendered as a floating hulk to the Allies on September 21st, 1945. Haguro, though, would not go quietly. After Leyte Gulf and in 1945, she was really the only heavy, large, major Japanese warship left coming into that spring. So much so that the British, now able to devote more of their attention after the defeat of the European powers, Nazi Germany namely, in May of 1945 started Operation Dukedom, which was essentially to go out and mop up the Japanese fleet, kind of a payback for early 1942. And it would be on May 16th that the Royal Navy would close in on her, and she would be sunk with a combination of multiple shells and 2 to 3 torpedoes. And then she would glug, glug, glug to the bottom. So, even though she was the last active, capable warship in the Imperial Navy's arsenal, Myoko here would actually survive the war in a technical sense, even if she wasn't seaworthy. But yeah, these were very heavily armed cruisers when they were designed and developed and put into service, and they were still very powerful and very ominous in World War II. And they would lead to the next class, which was actually very similar. So I'll do that on the next episode. If you have any questions, please do post them below. As always, if you could like, share, and subscribe, that would be great. With that said, this is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.